if you are open to doubling your salary anywhere from 3 to 6 months through learning a new language, then this is something that you should definitely give a go. And if you're in your 20s, and this applies to anyone, but especially if you're in your 20s, living in a day and age that we do today, this is a real opportunity that wasn't there decades ago, where maybe computers, programming, and resources weren't what it is today. So in this video, I'd like to cover how almost anybody can double their salary from 3 to 6 months through coding. And how do I know this is possible? Well, it's exactly what I did. Hi guys, my name is Patrick Chong and I am a former banker turned software engineer. So I've been in the banking industry for over 4 years, at which point I decided it was time for a change. I started learning coding on my own, and very recently I was lucky enough to land a role as a software engineer. And yes, that does mean I've very fortunately managed to double my banking salary. Just to emphasize, that's not some sort of weird flex. I think it's just a case in point I'd like to use, because the banking industry is of course known for paying above average wages in exchange for working shorter than usual hours. And so even at this higher than average pay, I was able to double my salary through learning coding and becoming a software engineer. And again, in this video, I'd like to cover how it's possible for almost anybody to do the same. Now, of course, if you are a manager at a multinational company, this is probably not very likely. But if you're like the most of us, where you've been in your role from anywhere between 1 to 10 years, and it pays close to the average salary in the UK or the US, then doubling your salary within 3 to 6 months is very, very achievable. And I like to share exactly how I managed to do this, so you can do the same. Now, the first thing to address is that when people see an Asian face, of course, you would assume, oh, he studies very hard, he's got an Asian background, he must be naturally smart. Well, that could not be further from the truth. I'm not saying I'm not very smart, but at the same time, I was brought up in the UK, where I have spent most of my life. Most of my friends are from very diverse backgrounds. I went to an average university. Granted, it was a Russell Group university, but it wasn't one of the top universities. So I wouldn't say I'm smarter than any other average person. What I would say is that I do work very hard. Working hard will get you very far in life and anything that you want, especially when it comes to coding. And so my journey began having not written a single line of code. And to be honest, about 2 years ago, I would not have even known what coding is. And today, earning a 6-figure salary, I can tell you that it has been very much worth it, investing the time upfront to learn coding. So in this video, I would like to cover 3 main things. Broadly speaking, how I managed to learn coding in just 3 months, what I covered and how I went from learning coding to landing a job anywhere from between 3 and 6 months later. I'd also like to cover how coding is possible for absolutely anyone. I personally know construction workers who have learned coding and are making 3 times what they used to make as software engineers. And finally, I'd also like to cover the benefits of coding, because while there are many more benefits than drawbacks when I compare it to banking, it's of course also very nice to know what you're working towards. So a good way to describe learning coding is literally like learning a new language. In fact, I think learning coding is far easier than learning a new language. And I'm not just saying that because I now know how to code, but I'm also saying that because with coding, things are very, very logical. As you learn new concepts, they relate to other concepts. Whereas when you learn a new language, very often you just have different letters put together with different words, and different words put together in different sentences. And granted, sometimes there is some logic to that, but in coding, most things have logic, and you can follow on from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And so in my opinion, it is far easier to learn coding. Having said that, I'm sure most of us will know a second language, or at some point would have learned a second language. And it is honestly no different than learning a second language. And I think it's a shame for a lot of people to disregard coding as something just being very difficult and only available for those of us who are smart. And it really is a shame, because the demand for coding out there today is so high. And if you can pick up this language, which again, in my opinion, is easier than learning a new language, then you can almost guarantee to double your salary in a relatively short space of time. In normal jobs, if you're talking about doubling your salary, you're talking about staying with the company for at least 5 years, if not much longer. And so I think this is a great opportunity, and the downsides are so low, because learning coding at the end of the day is completely free. I did not join a boot camp, I did not pay any tutors, I literally learned everything that I know today online, and it's what I used to get a job. So then let's move on to the second topic of today's video, which is how I learned coding. And so the first thing I did was, just like with any other language, you need to know the alphabet. And in the same way, in coding, you have something called syntax. And syntax is essentially the rules and the alphabet of the coding language. So I spent anywhere between 2 to 3 weeks just watching YouTube videos and learning, in my case, Python, which is one of the more popular coding languages out there today. And there's really no need to pay for any courses. There's so many courses that are free on YouTube. I'll link some in the description below, and let me know in the comments if you'd like any recommendations on which ones to start with. And I would recommend that anyone just starting out coding, or for those of you who have already started coding and would like to just make sure that all your fundamentals are correct, again, drop a message in the description and I'm happy to point you in the right direction in terms of which videos you should watch to make sure that your knowledge is up to scratch, where if you are preparing for a coding interview. So then the final topic of today's video will be how I landed a job as a software engineer. And just going back a bit to what I said earlier, I think it's such a shame that a lot of people just disregard coding as this difficult thing to learn. And there are so many opportunities out there, and the demand for coding is so high right now, and in my opinion will be for at least the next 5 years. And so my journey was, I spent the first 2-3 weeks learning the syntax of coding. I then moved on to solving coding questions. And for those of you who are familiar with coding, you'll know that that's the bread and butter of coding. So while you learn the language, the syntax, and the way things are put together, it's very important to be able to practice it. So if I compare it to learning a language, learning it abstractly is very different from writing and speaking. When you solve coding questions, it's very much like you're writing and speaking. You're using the language to solve problems. And so after 2 to 3 weeks of learning how the fundamentals of Python worked, I moved on to solving coding questions, where I spent at least the next month and a half just going through questions, question by question. So finally, after spending about 2 months solving coding problems, learning the basics and fundamentals of coding, I then moved on to preparing for interviews. Now in interviews, yes, you'll be asked coding questions, but you'll also be asked very general coding knowledge. And this is where I think it's worth picking up 1 or 2 books when you start preparing for your coding interviews. It's not going to take very long. You just need to know some basic concepts in coding. And for those of you who are preparing for coding interviews now, the best piece of advice that I've ever gotten is to just apply. You'll never know fully whether or not you're ready until you actually start applying and seeing whether or not you're able to answer the coding interview questions. Now, for me, I think I spent far too long preparing. I didn't really get out there and understand what was needed. And there is only so much that you can prepare and practice in terms of coding, actual coding questions. But what you're asked about coding in general, it's actually a lot easier. And once you've done a number of interviews, you will see that this is a very repetitive process, and the questions that you get asked are very repetitive. And so the best piece of advice, if you're now preparing for a coding interview, is just to go out there and start applying. So the third and final thing I'd like to cover in this video are the benefits of being a software engineer or coding as a living. And so I can only compare it fairly to banking because it's something that I've done in the past. In fact, I was a banker for 4 years. I started on a graduate program with HSBC. I eventually quit 4 years later to become a software engineer. The first thing that comes to mind when thinking about the benefits is your time. When I say time, I mean your flexibility of time. You're not stuck to a desk from 9 to 5, 9 to 6, or if you're an investment banker, I guess 9 to 12 every single day. You've got a lot more flexibility with your time. As long as you get your work done, you are essentially free to do what you want. You're not really time bound so much so as work bound, which for me is a very good reason to choose software engineering, because I'm a very hard worker, I get my work done and then some, and I still have time left over, which does give me time to do other things. Of course, in some weeks that's not possible because there's a lot of work to do, but in other cases I do have more control over my time. Working is also a lot more flexible, where in banking I was essentially tied to my desk and I had to come in most days. With software engineering across the board, you generally have the flexibility to work from home or work from anywhere essentially that you want to work from. And I think that's a very nice thing, because sometimes when you don't feel like commuting in the mornings, then you have the option to work from home. And I go as far as saying that a lot of companies also allow you to work from abroad. So if your family is not in the UK or not where you are currently, you can move abroad temporarily and work there for a few months, a year, for example. And I think that's a very nice thing about software engineering in general. You do have a lot more flexibility with both your time, with both your work and where you're working from, and essentially your lifestyle, which is something I think is very, very underrated and should be considered when you're thinking about what job you want to do, especially if it's for the long term. A fourth benefit, if you like, is also the salary. So software engineering in general, because it's a bit more specialized, you can expect. So I'll pull up a page where you can see the average salary in the UK, what it is in 2020, 2021, and then we compare this to the average software engineering salary in 2020 and 2021. And as you can see, it's considerably higher. And I think with software engineering, the more years you are with the company, generally it's much easier to get promoted, especially as you build your knowledge, you build your understanding of how the company works, and you can work your way up very, very quickly. And your results or your career is driven very much by how hard you work and how much, when I say how hard you work, it is the work that you produce, the results, but at the same time, it's also how much you are learning, how much you understand, and essentially how much value you can bring to the company. For me, that was a very attractive aspect of software engineering, where you do have control over your career, whereas in a lot of other companies, like in banking, you are in a lot of cases just waiting for somebody to retire, waiting for the company, if they're expanding, to open up a new role, and your career prospects are very much contingent on somebody moving roles or the company growing, and it's not sort of in your control. Whereas in software engineering, it is very much in your control. In some cases, it does mean you have to move companies, but given the demand of software engineers today, the demand's not going anywhere, because technology and coding is the future. That about covers it for the benefits of software engineering. I will cover some of the drawbacks in a different video. It can vary from case to case, so it's hard to just cover it all, whereas the benefits, I think, are universal when it comes to software engineering. And I'd like to close by just saying that lifestyle is so important. And when you think about your career, and in 99% of people's cases, you will be working, if you're in your 20s, at least for the next 40, 50 years until you retire. And in a lot of people's cases, unfortunately, the savings and the pension isn't enough to cover your retirement. So people often have to work beyond their retirement age. Whilst money is very, very important and software engineering gives you more than most other jobs, I would say that lifestyle is also another consideration. You do want to have control over your time. You do want to be growing as a person, and software engineering offers you this flexibility of both your work, your time, and where you can work from. Lifestyle is really important. Work-life balance is very, very important. And if you're planning to work in a certain career in the long term, these are things you definitely want to be thinking about. So then that brings us to the end of this video. I'd just like to round off by saying, in my opinion, having gone through this journey myself, from not even knowing what coding is to today, where it's something that I do every single day, I find it so rewarding. I think that everybody should give it a chance. You might do it and you might not enjoy it, but I think at least you have tried it. And if you are open to doubling your salary anywhere from 3 to 6 months through learning a new language, then this is something that you should definitely give a go. And if you're in your 20s, and this applies to anyone, but especially if you're in your 20s, living in a day and age that we do today, this is a real opportunity that wasn't there decades ago, where maybe computers, programming, and resources weren't what it is today. That's my one piece of advice. Really just get out there, start learning coding, apply to jobs, and double your salary. That'll be everything for this video. I hope you've all enjoyed it. If you'd like to ask any specific questions about my journey or coding in general, feel free to leave a comment in the description. I will be answering those as soon as possible. Thanks guys, and I'll catch you at the next video.